The auction was scheduled for March 14th. Cold morning, mud everywhere. The kind of day where your boots stick to the ground and the wind cuts through 3 layers like they're not even there. The estate sale company had set up along the gravel drive leading into the Hollenbeck farm just outside Manning, Iowa. Folding tables, registration booth, coffee in paper cups that nobody was drinking, and lined up in perfect formation across the east pasture, like soldiers waiting to be deployed one last time, sat 14 John Deere tractors, every one of them green, every one of them maintained like museum pieces. The oldest was a 4020 from 1968. The newest was a pair of 9RX 640s purchased 18 months before Thomas Hollenbeck died. Thomas had built the operation from 900 acres to just over 4,000 in 4 decades. He'd done it with John Deere iron and nothing else. He believed in the brand the way some men believe in Scripture. And when the cancer came fast and took him in 11 weeks, he left behind a will that was 2 pages long. Most of it dealt with land distribution and water rights. But there was one paragraph that his son would never forget. It was typed in bold. It said that under no circumstances should the John Deere equipment ever leave the family. It said the machines were not just tools, they were the foundation. It said selling them would be a betrayal of everything he built. 6 months later, his son stood in the auction crowd and watched a 9RX 640 sell for $385,000 to a farmer from Nebraska. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the pasture. Sold. 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 One after another. The whole fleet went in 90 minutes. By noon, the pasture was empty, and the Hollenbeck family was $3.1 million richer. And standing in the mud with his arms crossed and his jaw locked tight was David Hollenbeck, 34 years old, 4th-generation farmer, and the man who had just violated his father's final wish in front of 200 people. His mother hadn't shown up. She told him she couldn't watch it. His uncle called him a disgrace the night before and hung up. His younger brother drove past the farm that morning and didn't stop. The only person standing next to David was his wife, Emily, and even she looked uncertain. She believed in him. She trusted his judgment. But she also knew what this decision meant. It wasn't just about tractors. It was about legacy. It was about family. And David had just set all of it on fire in front of the entire county. But David wasn't second-guessing. Not yet. Because 3 days earlier, he'd signed the biggest equipment purchase of his life. He'd walked into the Massey Ferguson dealership in Carroll and put down deposits on 4 8S 265 tractors, 2 8S 305 models, and an Ideal 10T combine. The total package came to $2.3 million. Delivery was scheduled for late March, financing was locked, and every single person in his family thought he'd lost his mind. They didn't understand the numbers, or maybe they did and just didn't want to believe them. Because what David had seen over the last 2 years wasn't sentiment. It wasn't loyalty. It was operational failure disguised as tradition. His father's John Deere 9RX tractors were burning an average of 22 gallons of diesel per hour under full load during spring tillage. The DPF regeneration cycles were cutting into field time every 4 to 6 hours. Maintenance costs were running $47,000 annually across the fleet. Parts delays were extending downtime. And the dealer relationship his father had worshipped was starting to feel more like a trap than a partnership. When David had asked about upgrading to more fuel-efficient models, the dealer's response was polite but clear. Loyalty gets rewarded. Disloyalty gets remembered. That's when David started looking elsewhere. Not because he wanted to, but because the farm's profit margins were collapsing, and nobody at the John Deere dealership seemed interested in solving the problem. They wanted him to buy more. Bigger, newer. They wanted him to finance his way out of inefficiency. And David realized that's exactly what his father had been doing for years, spending money to cover up operational waste, calling it tradition. So he scheduled a demo day with the Massey Ferguson dealer. He didn't tell anyone. He drove out alone on a Tuesday afternoon and met a sales rep named Greg Brunner in an empty field south of Templeton. Greg didn't pitch him, didn't try to sell him on brand heritage or nostalgia. He just handed David the keys to an 8S 305 and said, "Try it." David climbed into the cab and spent 3 hours running the machine through tillage, transport, and PTO work. And by the time he climbed down, he knew. The fuel burn was 17% lower than his 9RX. The cab was quieter, the CVT transmission was smoother, the Echo power engine didn't bog under load, and the price per horsepower was $41,000 less than an equivalent John Deere. It wasn't about betrayal, it wasn't about rebellion, it was about survival. And David made his decision that day in the field. He was going all in on Massey Ferguson. He was liquidating the entire John Deere fleet. And he was doing it knowing full well that half the county would call him a fool, and the other half would wait for him to fail. The first tractor arrived on March 22nd. A Massey Ferguson 8S265 with 260 horsepower and a DynaVT transmission. It rolled off the dealer's trailer and into the machine shed that had housed nothing but green paint for 40 years. David stood there staring at it. The red and silver gleamed under the LED lights. It looked foreign. It looked wrong. But when he fired it up and listened to the engine settle into idle, smooth, and confident, he felt something his father's equipment had stopped giving him years ago. He felt optimism. By April 1st, the whole fleet was delivered. 4 8S265s, 2 8S305s, one Ideal 10T combined sitting in the corner of the shed like a statement piece. The financing was locked at 4.7% over 7 years. The payment schedule was aggressive but manageable if the farm hit projected yields. And David had exactly one growing season to prove he hadn't just destroyed everything his father built. The neighbors noticed immediately. You couldn't miss it. A fleet of Massey Ferguson tractors rolling through fields that had been synonymous with John Deere for decades. It was disorienting, it was uncomfortable, and people talked, at the co-op, at the diner, at church. The consensus was clear. David Hollenbeck had made an emotional decision in the wake of his father's death. He was trying to prove something. He was rejecting his heritage. And when those Massey Fergusons started breaking down, when the parts delays hit, when the dealer support fell apart, everyone would be there to watch him crawl back to John Deere and beg for forgiveness. But David didn't care about the whispers. He cared about performance. And in those first few weeks, the Massey Fergusons delivered. Spring tillage went faster than it ever had. The 8S305s pulled 12-shank rippers through heavy clay without hesitation. Fuel consumption was tracking exactly where the dealer had promised. Cab comfort was exceptional. His operators, the 2 seasonal guys he hired every year, were skeptical at first. But after 3 days, both of them admitted the Massey Ferguson machines were easier to run than anything they'd been in before. David started keeping detailed logs, fuel burn per acre, hours between service intervals, downtime incidents, cost per operational hour. He wasn't doing it to prove anything to his family. He was doing it because if this gamble failed, he needed to know exactly why. And if it succeeded, he wanted documentation nobody could argue with. By mid-May, the operation was humming. Planting was ahead of schedule. The 8S265s were running 14-hour days with 0 mechanical issues. The DynaVT transmission was handling load transitions better than any CVT David had ever used, and the fuel savings were adding up faster than projected. He was burning 11% less diesel than the previous year across the same acreage. That translated to $18,000 in savings over 6 weeks. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and it was measurable. Then June hit, and everything changed. It started with a phone call from his banker, not his usual ag loan officer, the regional director, a guy David had only met twice. The tone was professional but pointed. The bank had received some concerns from other clients in the area, concerns about the Hollenbeck operations equipment choices, concerns about resale value on Massey Ferguson iron in a John Deere-dominated region, concerns about whether David had made a sustainable decision or a reactionary one. The director didn't say the loan was in jeopardy, but he made it clear the bank was watching. And if performance slipped, if yields disappointed, if cash flow tightened, the conversation would get a lot more serious. David hung up and sat in his truck for 20 minutes. The pressure was starting to build. It wasn't just family anymore. It wasn't just neighbors. It was institutional. The bank was nervous. And in agriculture, when your lender gets nervous, your options start shrinking fast. 2 weeks later, the first mechanical issue hit. One of the 8S265s threw a hydraulic line during a field cultivation pass. It wasn't catastrophic. It was a wear item, a hose that had rubbed against a bracket and split under pressure. But it happened at 4 p.m. on a Friday, and when David called the Massey Ferguson dealer for a replacement part, he got bad news. The part was back-ordered, 3-day lead time minimum, maybe longer. David had the tractor down for 5 days. 5 days during the narrow window for pre-emergent spraying. He had to pull an older machine out of semi-retirement to cover the workload. And while 5 days wasn't a disaster, it was enough to reignite every doubt his family and neighbors had been nursing since March. Word spread fast. The Massey broke down. Parts took a week. David's gamble was starting to crack. His uncle called, not to check in, to remind him that John Deere parts were available same day at 3 dealerships within 30 miles. His brother sent a text that just said, "Told you." His mother still wasn't speaking to him. And at the co-op, when David walked in to pick up chemical, the guys at the counter didn't say anything. They just looked at him. That look that said, "We're waiting for you to admit you were wrong." David didn't give them the satisfaction. He paid for his order and left. But the weight was building, and he knew the farm couldn't afford many more delays like that. The Massey Ferguson dealer apologized, promised faster turnaround on future orders, offered to stock more common parts locally, but the damage was done. The perception had shifted. The Massey Fergusons weren't bulletproof, and in a region where equipment downtime could cost you an entire season, perception mattered as much as reality. July brought heat, extreme heat, the kind that turns cornfields into ovens and pushes equipment to the edge. David's 2 8S305s were running grain cart duty, shuttling corn from the field to the dryer during the early wheat harvest. The loads were heavy, the days were long, and the tractors performed. No overheating, no power loss. The ATCO engines handled the sustained load better than the John Deere 9RXs ever had. David's operators were impressed. The fuel economy held, and for a few weeks David started to believe the worst was behind him. Then the drought hit. Not localized, regional. The entire Midwest saw rainfall deficit through late July and into August. Corn yields started projecting down, way down. David's fields, which had been on track for 210 bushels per acre, were now looking at 175 if they were lucky. That was a $320,000 revenue hit. And when you're carrying $2.3 million in new equipment debt, a revenue hit like that doesn't just sting. It threatens the entire operation. David ran the numbers every night. He adjusted projections. He looked at crop insurance payouts. He explored short-term operating loans. And every scenario came back to the same conclusion. If yields stayed suppressed and grain prices didn't rally, he was going to have trouble making his equipment payments in year one. The Massey Fergusons weren't the problem. The drought was. But that distinction didn't matter. Because if David defaulted on those payments, the narrative would be simple. He abandoned his father's legacy, bought the wrong equipment, and lost the farm. His wife could see it wearing on him. He wasn't sleeping. He was snapping at the kids. He'd stopped returning calls from his family because he didn't have the energy to defend himself anymore. And one night in mid-August, sitting at the kitchen table with a laptop full of spreadsheets that wouldn't balance, Emily asked him the question he'd been avoiding. "Do you regret it?" David didn't answer right away. He stared at the numbers. He thought about his father. He thought about the auction. He thought about the Massey Fergusons sitting in the shed, machines that had performed exactly as promised but were now tied to a season that was falling apart through no fault of their own. And he said no. "I don't regret the equipment. I regret the timing. I regret that I didn't have one more year of buffer." But the decision was right. The execution was just unlucky. Emily nodded. She didn't argue. She just reached across the table and put her hand on his. And David realized that whether the farm survived this season or not, he'd already lost something he couldn't get back. He'd lost his family's respect, he'd lost his father's blessing, and he'd lost the safety net that came with doing things the way they'd always been done. September brought the harvest. The ideal 10T combine ran flawlessly. Capacity was excellent. Grain quality was clean. The cab technology made night operations easier than anything David had used before. But the yields were brutal. 178 bushels per acre on corn, 48 bushels on soybeans, both well below break-even. The operation lost $290,000 on the year, and while some of that was offset by crop insurance, David was still short on his equipment payment by $73,000. He called the bank, explained the situation, asked for a payment deferral. The regional director was polite but firm. The bank would allow a 90-day extension on the next payment. But after that, if cash flow didn't improve, they'd need to discuss restructuring the loan or liquidating assets. The message was clear. David had 1 quarter to turn this around, or the Massey Fergusons he'd bet everything on would be heading back to auction. That night, David sat in the machine shed alone. The lights were off. The only illumination came from the orange glow of the service panel on one of the 8S305s. He walked over and ran his hand along the hood. The paint was still perfect. The machine had 847 hours on it. It had never missed a day. It had never let him down. And now it might get repossessed because the rain didn't fall and the market didn't cooperate. David thought about his father, about the will, about the paragraph in bold that said never sell the John Deere equipment, and he wondered if his father had been protecting the farm or protecting his own ego. Because the truth was, those John Deere tractors had been bleeding the operation dry for years. They were expensive to run, expensive to maintain, and tied to a dealer network that prioritized volume over partnership. His father had been too loyal to see it. Or maybe he saw it and didn't care. Maybe tradition mattered more than profit. Maybe legacy mattered more than survival. But David couldn't afford that luxury. He had a wife, he had kids, he had employees who depended on him, and he had a farm that would outlive all of them if he made the right decisions. The Massey Fergusons were the right decision. He knew that. The numbers proved it. The performance proved it. But the timing had been catastrophic, and now he had to live with the consequences. Winter came. David picked up contract work, custom tillage, snow removal, anything to generate cash flow. The Massey Ferguson 8S265s became his workhorses. He ran them on job sites all over the county, and something unexpected started happening. Other farmers noticed. They saw the machines working, they saw the fuel economy, they saw the uptime, and they started asking questions. Not hostile questions, genuine ones. How's the dealer support? How's the parts availability? How's the cab compared to Deere? David answered honestly. He didn't sugarcoat the parts delay from June. He didn't pretend the drought hadn't nearly bankrupted him. But he also didn't hide the performance data, the fuel savings, the lower maintenance costs, the operational advantages. And slowly, the narrative started shifting. The Massey Fergusons weren't a mistake. They were a calculated risk that had been hit by bad luck. By February, David had generated enough contract revenue to cover the deferred payment. He called the bank and cleared the balance. The regional director sounded surprised, almost impressed. He said the bank appreciated David's hustle, and while they'd still be monitoring the operation closely, the immediate pressure was off. David hung up and exhaled for the first time in months. He wasn't out of the woods, not even close. He still had 6 years of payments ahead of him. He still had a family that wouldn't speak to him. He still had a father's ghost hanging over every decision. But he'd survived year 1. Barely. And that counted for something. Spring 2025 arrived with better weather. Soil moisture levels were improved. Planting conditions were ideal, and David's Massey Ferguson fleet went to work with renewed purpose. The 8S305s handled the heavy tillage. The 8S265s managed planting and spraying. The Ideal 10T sat ready in the shed, waiting for harvest. And this time, David wasn't just hoping for survival. He was planning for profitability. By mid-June, the crop looked good, really good. Corn was tall and healthy. Soybeans were filling in thick, and the projected yields were climbing back toward historical averages. David ran the numbers again. If the weather held, if the market stayed stable, if nothing catastrophic happened, he'd be profitable. Not just breaking even, actually profitable. Enough to make his equipment payments on time and start rebuilding the operation's cash reserves. July brought perfect rain. August brought ideal temps. And by the time harvest rolled around in September, David was looking at 205 bushels per acre on corn and 58 on soybeans. The Ideal 10T ran for 19 straight days without a single mechanical issue. Grain quality was exceptional. And when David tallied the final numbers, The farm had netted $340,000 for the year. He made every equipment payment early. He rebuilt his relationship with the bank, and he started getting phone calls from other farmers in the county, guys who'd watched him struggle, guys who'd whispered about his mistakes. Now they wanted to know about Massey Ferguson. They wanted demos. They wanted fuel consumption data. They wanted to see the maintenance logs. David didn't gloat. He didn't rub it in anyone's face. He just shared what he knew. And by the end of the year, 3 other farms in the county had placed orders for Massey Ferguson equipment. The dealer in Carroll called David personally to thank him. He said David's operation had become the reference account for the entire region. The proof that Massey Ferguson could compete, could win, could replace green paint in the heartland and come out stronger. But the victory felt hollow. Because David's mother still wouldn't return his calls. His brother still avoided family gatherings if David was going to be there. And his uncle had made it clear that as far as he was concerned, David had dishonored the family name, and no amount of profit would change that. David thought about that a lot, about whether he'd made the right choice, about whether saving the farm was worth fracturing the family. And the answer was always the same. He didn't have a choice. Not really. The farm was dying under the weight of tradition and loyalty to a brand that didn't care if the Hollenbeck family survived or not. His father had been a great farmer, but he'd been blind to the operational inefficiencies that were eroding the farm's future. And David had refused to let sentiment destroy what 4 generations had built. The Massey Fergusons weren't just tractors. They were proof that legacy doesn't mean doing things the same way forever. It means doing whatever it takes to make sure there's still a farm for the next generation. David had chosen survival over sentiment, and while it cost him his family's approval, it saved the operation. By spring 2026, the Massey Ferguson 8S fleet had logged over 4,200 combined hours. Fuel savings totaled $81,000 compared to projected John Deere costs. Maintenance expenses were running 23% lower. Uptime was 97%, and the dealer relationship was stronger than anything David had experienced with John Deere. When he needed parts, they arrived in 48 hours. When he had questions, the sales rep answered his phone. When he needed financing on a used planter, the dealer helped him structure a deal that made sense. David stood in the machine shed one morning before dawn and looked at the fleet, the red and silver paint, the ATCO power badges, the Dyna VT decals, and he thought about his father, about the will, about the paragraph in bold, and he realized his father had been wrong. Not wrong about loving the farm, but wrong about what it took to protect it. Loyalty to a brand wasn't strength, it was vulnerability, and David had been willing to risk everything to prove it. The farm was profitable, the equipment was paid down, the operation was expanding, and 300 miles away, in a cemetery outside Manning, Iowa, Thomas Hollenbeck's headstone sat surrounded by cornfields that were still producing, still thriving, still Hollenbeck land, just painted a different color. David never got his family back. His mother passed away 2 years later without ever speaking to him again. His brother sold his share of the inheritance land and moved to Colorado. His uncle wrote him out of the will, but the farm survived. And David's son, 9 years old, already talks about driving the Massey Ferguson 8S 305 when he's old enough. Already talks about taking over the operation someday. Already understands that the machines in the shed aren't just equipment, they're the reason he'll have something to inherit. David Hollenbeck didn't honor his father's final wish. He violated it, publicly, completely, and in doing so, he saved everything his father actually cared about. The land, the legacy, the farm. He just did it with Massey Ferguson red instead of John Deere green. And in the end, that made all the difference.